Think about this with respect to Greg Nathan's curve. At some point, you're going to want to divorce your franchisor. And you're going to justify it the same way that everybody justifies a divorce. They'll tell themselves a very sad story about how, badly they've been done by. Mentally, they're thinking about, oh, I'll just tell my friends and my neighbors and my close, people close by my sad story. And no, it's not going to work that way.
Welcome to the Franchise Hot Seat Podcast, where we talk about all things franchising. Now, here's your host, Dr. John P. Hayes.
Michael Webster is my guest today, and Michael got into franchising as an attorney, but then came over to the marketing and development side of franchising and has worked with many years with our friend Joe Caruso. And Michael is one of these very intuitive people who figures out what's going on in franchising, and with that legal background is also able to find out where the funny stuff or the sad stuff might be in a franchise relationship. Michael, thank you for joining me today. And I want to talk to you right off the top about our colleague in Australia, our friend in franchising, Greg Nathan, who created a chart that's interesting that shows the flow of the franchisee factor, where the buyer of a franchise at first is gleeful, so we go from glee all the way across to where we want to be in a relationship of we with franchisor and franchisee. But there's a lot that happens in between. There's fee, there's me, there's free, there's C, where the franchisee is suddenly thinking, I don't know that I really need that franchisor involved in my life anymore. And of course, the ideal in the franchise relationship is to get a franchisor and franchisee on the same page where they realize they need one another. What do you think about that?
Well, I think it's a great picture. I've always liked Greg's work. I think he's done, these are one of these pictures that a lot of work, psychological, the measurement has gone into. He's a keen observer of franchise relations. And I think the important thing to see in it is that there really are three big categories. The one is where the franchise operator starts off as being dependent. Then they think they should be independent while still under contract. And then finally, they come to a more mature phase where they see that we're working in this together, all for all of us. What's in it for we, you might say. And I think Greg's has been very consistent to point out that there's no way of rushing this process. Mm-hmm. And so there's some parts of this process that you just have to, for lack of a better word, endure, because it's not, some parts of it for a particular operator aren't as fun as other parts.
Yeah.
So
great. It's a process that you endure, and you can't say, well, I'll get through this in a year. You probably won't. It's over a period of time, usually much longer than that. Well, one of the things that I've always appreciated about you, Michael, is that with your legal background, you can quickly look at a document and say, this doesn't work the way you think it might work, or this isn't going to work, or there are some things in there that you ought to be aware of that we tend not to talk about in franchising. We do a lot of talking. I'm a proponent of franchising. You are as well. We think it's a great methodology, but there are issues that people need to address before getting into a franchise, before becoming a franchisor or a franchisee. And I want to talk with you about the franchisee side, because the franchise contract is written by the franchisor's attorneys or probably attorneys.
Well, even better, it's written by a whole group of attorneys. Every year they get together and figure out better ways to construct contracts for their clients. And good for them as a group, right?
Yeah, exactly. And, the methodology works. It's been around since the late 1800s. Hopefully we don't screw it up in our lifetime. I don't think that that's going to happen. But there are some issues, and you've identified at least 10 weaknesses in franchising, or what we might say, what's wrong with franchising, and you can pick them out of the contract. And I want to discuss as many of those with you today as we can. So let's start with choice of venue. What's that about in the franchise agreement?
Yeah, think about this with respect to Greg Nason's curve. At some point, you're going to want to divorce your franchisor. And you're going to justify it the same way that everybody justifies a divorce. They'll tell themselves a very sad story about how, badly they've been done by, and they'll expect that they can tell this story to a jury, B, a jury of people nearby, and that's the choice venue. And what they're going to find is even if to try and tell a story at all, they're likely going to have to travel out of state. And that's not something that they were bargaining for in the first place. Mentally, they're thinking about, I'll just tell my friends and my neighbors and my people close by my sad story. And no, it's not going to work that way. You're going to have to travel, and that's going to be costly. It'll be costly for you. It'll be costly for your lawyer.
So if there's arbitration involved, you as the franchisee, you don't get to select that. If the franchisor is in West Palm Beach and you live in Toronto, you're coming to West Palm Beach to
yes,
for the arbitration. You didn't get to select the venue where we can tell our stories.
Right. No neutral site. And you might correctly think that if the franchisor is picking venue all of the time, they may have a home field advantage.
So what you're giving up your due process rights? Is that too strong of a statement?
No, that's exactly right. And it's a fascinating legal question to me is, well, how could you agree to give up, especially in the given the Constitution, American Constitution, how do you give up a due process right, like a right to jury trial? Yeah, you can waive it, but you have to know a waiving is for an agreement, right? Okay, now that I'm faced with it, I'd rather choose to do this or that. And usually it's because I'm getting something. How can you waive that right in advance without knowing what the issues are? Like if it's a small issue, sure, let's go to arbitration.
Yeah.
If it's a fundamental breach, you want a jury trial, I would think.
Or you've waived the right to a jury trial.
Yeah.
So what do you say about this as a lawyer and as a proponent of franchising and as someone who's involved in franchise development, helping people become franchisees? Do you not sign the agreement? Can you negotiate the due process section of the franchise agreement?
The due process selections are going to be hard to negotiate. And you're going to have to look at the mediation sections. Some mediation sections are very thin, just pro forma. Others are more complex. You're going to have to look at the litigation history and be prepared. I mean, look, if you looked at Subway's litigation history, you would say, wow, look, they have all of this litigation. I'm never going to sign a Subway agreement. Yet many people did extraordinarily well, even in that litigation environment. It's more a matter of being prepared for what's coming as opposed to, in this case, being able to negotiate it. This one's a tough one to get any relief on because it's systemic. And worse is you're taking money out of the pocket of lawyers. Mm-hmm. That's never a good thing.
So you got to know going in that if this doesn't go well and you're going to get a divorce, so to speak, in franchising, you've waived your due process rights, the majority of them, and this is going to be more costly for you to get out of it, perhaps to stay in it.
It's going to be costly, and then there's all of this skirmishing in advance, your lawyer will want to try to beat the arbitration agreement. They'll have some legal arguments for the choice of venue. There'll be state law which may overlap, and you could spend hundreds of thousands of dollars just trying to get to a hearing, the arbitration hearing. That's like, that's, unless there's a huge amount of at stake, that's probably not something you should be doing.
Mm-hmm.
But yes, you're right. You've got to understand that.
So we get past the due process issues. What's this? I've got to sign a personal guarantee. My spouse has to sign a personal guarantee. And there are liquidated damages should I decide to leave the franchise before my time is up. Please explain.
Yeah, no, that's really one of the really hard clauses, financial penalties upon if you wanted to leave, and presumably you want to leave because you're not making any money. The franchisor maybe making some money off your royalties, but you're not making any money. You're losing money, and you think, well, this is a losing business. I should just shut it. That's a reasonable, rational choice. But what you will find in many franchise agreements is two things operating together. One is a liquidated damages that says that the franchisor is entitled to the projected royalties to the end of the term, whether you were operating or not, or operating at a loss. And just in case you thought, well, that's okay because my franchise LLC can't pay and is bankrupt, who cares? Then they say, and not only is your LLC responsible, you, John, are personally responsible.
Right.
We tried to get your dog responsible, but anyway, that will do it. So, and then, at the moment you're really at your weakest moment, the hardest clauses come to bear, and that makes you, when you're trying to negotiate a way to leave, far less, you're not in a position to think clearly because of all this financial pressure.
So just to understand this, I've signed a personal guarantee that goes beyond my LLC. That doesn't protect me. I'm personally on the hook for this franchise. So is perhaps my spouse. I think maybe that one you can negotiate more often to keep your spouse off.
I would negotiate all of these ones.
Okay.
Right. This is something that I would take a hard line on. I would never let somebody sign these without at least limiting them, capping them to a size.
Okay.
You have to know the exit fee.
So in a personal guarantee, I could agree. First of all, my stance is I'm not signing that. My spouse is, and I'm not either.
Right.
How often does that happen that franchisors will say, all right, we're going to waive the personal guarantee?
It depends on it depends on your negotiation strength. And, if you're saying, look, I'm going to do a multi-unit deal here, and I'm putting in a lot of money into this deal right up front, I'm not guaranteeing you a profit on my multi-unit development deal when I haven't even seen it. So, and by the way, you're not the only, franchise system in town.
Yeah.
So this is something you have to be strong on, unless, of course, your personal guarantee is worthless.
Right.
Then go ahead.
Go ahead and do it.
That maybe not a great signal.
Right. All right, but then there's also liquidated damages that most people don't know what that means, and they kind of skip over that. Doesn't seem important. But essentially, if you promise to pay the franchisor a minimum of $1,000 a month in royalties, that's $12,000 a year, and you promise to do that for 10 years in the franchise agreement, or 5 years, or 15 years, whatever it is. And along comes year 3, and for whatever reason, it may not just be, well, I'm not making any money. It may be you're making money, but you can't do it anymore for some reason. Health reason, for example, or geographic reason, or family crisis has occurred, and you've got to walk away. And the franchisor can say, okay, well, you've paid us for $36,000 of the $120,000 that you owe us. So you've got to pay these liquidated damages if you're going to walk away. What?
Yeah. And the liquidated damages clauses are getting better and better drafted by franchisors as they find out over time what courts will and will not accept. And at the beginning, courts were somewhat reluctant for various reasons to accept these. But then as they saw more of them, and remember, franchise attorneys are very good at going up and saying, okay, here's the disclosure regime. They had this amount of time. They signed an acknowledgement. They, had experienced counsel. They knew exactly what they were doing. So, where there are no out clauses here.
Yeah.
And you end up paying for something that strikes you and I as sort of ridiculous.
Mm-hmm.
I want to close this business. Why can't I close my business?
And walk away from it. And
walk away from it.
Yeah.
And the thing, suppose you said, okay, well, all right, I see then I'm going to sell my business. Well, they're going to use that liquidated damages plus the transfer payment as a way of extracting all of the surplus out of your of sale, or a lot of it out.
Yeah. So this is something to negotiate hard. Perhaps, if you get down to the wire and you say, I'm going to walk away, well, you owe us $100,000. Well, maybe you're going to get that, even at that point, negotiated down, depending on your situation, your lawyer, how much money you don't have, in fact.
Well, yeah, it's a good point, because even though you might be surprised and you come up with they've got this liquidated damages claim, there's a lot of things you can do on exiting that helps the franchisor that they could not get but for your cooperation, or that it's very costly to get. They have the right to take over the location if they want. They have the right to give it the customer lists. But, your cooperation in that is worth a lot to them, because otherwise they're running off to court trying to get injunctions every 2 weeks, which are extraordinarily expensive. And then at the end you say, okay, yeah, I'll do it. Well, you're better focused on saying, look, if I do these things, I want this reduced. But it's hard because, at that point, you're probably pretty angry. You're not thinking that clearly.
Yeah. So another area that's muddy, at least in franchising, and can sour the franchise relationship, I believe it's item 9, that in the franchise disclosure document. That's where the franchisor tells you everything you will be responsible for doing once you become a franchisee. And sit back, read item 9. That's going to be a lengthy litany of information, details, obligations on your part as the franchisee. And then, you might think, okay, I can be open 7 days a week. I can work 100 hours a week. I have to be present. I must do this, must wear a funny hat, must wear a tie, must say this. Okay, I can do all these things. And surely the franchisor is going to have similar kinds of obligations. I think you jump over 2 more items in the disclosure document. You won't have to spend much time reading what the franchisor promises to do for you. And I understand with good reason, because the more they promise to do for you, the more chance there is that they won't do something and you will litigate. So they keep it to a minimum. How does this work? You promise to do a lot, they don't promise to do as much. How does that balance out?
Well, it doesn't balance out, right? It doesn't balance out, but it's not necessarily intended to balance out. But you have to understand, you have all of these obligations listed, what you have to do, and many of them come with termination. If you don't do this, we will terminate. So there is a huge list of obligations, on the franchisee's side, as you correctly point out in item 9. Realistically, though, even though there is that huge list of obligations, you're not going to get terminated if you're paying your royalties, right? And that's why people just sort of, now, it's possible you can really annoy a franchisor, and they'll
or do something illegal, or take some action that drills a hole below the water line and is going to sink the entire network.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
But in this section where you agree to do certain things as a franchisee, and they send out somebody who's checking up on you. You don't necessarily know the mystery shopper is in your unit if it's a retail unit, or they're calling you if it's a service business, or they have their ways of finding out, wait a minute, you're not wearing the appropriate trade dress, and that's a violation. It's also spelled out in the contract that you won't be terminated today for that. How's that work? What's the process?
There's a lot of, that's why you have to go through these obligations and see, okay, does this give right to what's called a curable or non-curable violation? Can I remedy it? Okay. What sort of things do I get a second chance on, second or third chance? Some things are, no, there's no way of curing this. That means it's really up into, at that point, legally, the franchisor has the legal right to terminate the contract. Roughly, you can think of it that way. But when you look at these, it's very useful for a prospective franchisee to look at the differences between item 9, what they promise to do, and item 11, what the franchisor promises to do. If you had a marriage contract written the same way, you'd say, wait a minute.
I'm doing everything.
Yeah, I'm doing everything here. and what you're doing, you're saying, you're not even making breakfast. What's going on? So you have to be cognizant that once you sign that agreement, you are going to be under more scrutiny than you were ever under as an employee working even, in one of the most difficult corporate American companies.
So is it fair to say the legal obligations are one-sided, and one-sided is clearly in favor of the franchisor?
Yes. On these obligations, yes, it's very much in favor of the franchisor. Now, of course, in practice, that may not be the case. You can still have this legal asymmetry, but in practice, have a far more complementary relationship. But just remember, when push comes to shove, your obligations are stacked against you, and their basic obligation is to get you to the grand opening.
Yeah.
Yep. And collect revenue.
Yes. But this is also a part of a system that has worked for 100 years, that a good franchisor will understand, I've got to do something to help these people succeed, such as provide them with a system, train them to use the system, support them to use the system. And if you do that, if a franchisor does that, you really don't have to worry as much about item 11. And you can find out if the franchisor has a history of doing what they need to do to help franchisees become successful through your due diligence before you buy the franchise. And yet, it's one-sided. It's scary. You've got to realize they're not promising to do anything. They get you open, and then good luck.
Yeah, and the real difficulty, especially for times like now, is that in the restaurant industry and the hotel, the entire hospitality industry is going through a real technological change. How people accept payments, how they accept reservations, how they produce food, how they, the footprint of many QSRs is shrinking in order to accommodate both pickup and delivery. These are technological changes that, are not contemplated by the people who are drafting the agreement. So you've got to, you point out, yes, there's a system, but there's also that system has to be revised in the light of,
Yes. Things change.
Things change, technology changes. Yeah. And that's one of the things that I think is the hardest for a prospective operator to figure out. Do these people really know? Have they got a good plan going forward? Yeah, all the due diligence was in the past. What did they do in the past? All right, but are these the sort of people that are thinking in a forward manner?
Yeah. Now, we also, with all these legal obligations, signing this franchise agreement, we note that there are certain things the franchisor cannot change for the life of the agreement. For example, the royalty is 6.8%. It's going to remain 6.8% until this agreement expires, and you've got to sign a new one. And at that point, it might be higher. You might be able to negotiate lower, depending on how good of a franchisee you are. But it's not true to say, well, we can't change anything after you, the franchisee, signed the franchise agreement. We can't come back and change anything on you. That's not entirely true.
I think there's two ways that's not entirely true. Even though you might not sign or change the legal obligations, you might set a course of pattern or course of behavior, which is, not consistent with the strict interpretation of a contract. Getting an amendment after the fact may be hard. It's possible, but it may be hard because you got to bring something to the table. And one of the concerns I see right now with, I'll call them rapidly growing franchise systems, is people have signed these development agreements that commit them to a fairly rapid pace of development of a system that really doesn't have, enough, should not be thinking that we can develop that quickly because the rates are extraordinary. Those people are going to find that, unfortunately, that those development agreements are going to be read hard against them. Right?
One of the things in franchising that also works to the franchisor's advantage is what's been called historically the operations manual.
Yes.
But many franchisors don't like that term because of recent litigation and new ways of looking at the franchisor as possibly being the employer of franchisees and their employees. So they like to call it the franchise manual instead. But the operations manual tells you how to operate the business, when to do what, how much of it to do, how often to do it, etc. And in that manual, what if they say, well, we used to be open 5 days a week, now we're going to be open 7 days a week. Or we used to wear this really nice-looking green uniform that everybody really appealed to everyone. We're changing that now, we're going to black, or whatever. So franchisors can make some changes that you may not appreciate or didn't see coming as a franchisor.
Yeah, no, that is very important because I just want to touch on the joint employer, because I saw something really interesting in LinkedIn the other day. I was looking at the McDonald's corporate corporate LinkedIn page, not a franchise operators, and I saw all these jobs. And they were jobs for individuals at individual McDonald's locations.
Wow.
And I immediately thought, wow, you're leading the charge against joint employer.
Are those corporate-owned locations? And they weren't? No. Wow. Interesting.
Because all of them said, this is for an independent franchise operator. You will not be an employee of McDonald's. You will be an employee of such and such. And I thought, so you're centralizing job search on LinkedIn. Wow. Okay. I'll write that down. I had to bring that up. It was so fascinating. But yeah, You're absolutely right about the operations manual is that there's a general clause that says, you've got to follow the operations as explained in the operations manual. And then there's this wonderful, clause in various forms says, and we get to change that anytime we want. And you think, wait a minute.
Yeah, well, another negative in franchising that makes you think twice. Also, along with that, let's say your time is up and you want to leave the system. You're going to sell your asset. You started at zero and you've got $3 million in sales. You're going to have a very successful exit from this business, but there are still some post-exit behaviors that you've got to be aware of. Let's talk about those for a moment.
Sure. The first one is, and I've seen and you've seen too, is this worrying trend in the rising of transfer fees. You're selling your unit, and then the franchisor, used to want just an amount, maybe $5,000 to cover the administration of getting onboarding a new operator or doing the paperwork. And now you see transfer fees, in the 25, 30, 40,000 range. That for, some home-based franchise systems, that would take a significant chunk out of the business sales. So that's fairly worrisome.
And I don't understand that totally. That, if I'm exiting your system and you're going to we're going to sell my asset and you're going to sell it to an operator who they won't be as good as me perhaps in the beginning, but they will over time. I'm probably finding the buyer myself.
Yeah.
Maybe you help me. Where's $25,000 in that? You're not losing anything. Yeah, there's some time involved, but it's minimal.
No, I entirely agree. And that's one of the things you, again, should look at carefully to try and negotiate at the beginning, because at the beginning, the franchisor is going to give up that easy money because, they're thinking of just having you on board. But
sure,
it's too much for too little being given. It's just I don't see it as anything other than a cash grab at the end.
Mm-hmm. So another issue is, I've been successful at doing this. In fact, I'm actually better at running this business than the franchisor is at this point. So I'm going to sell my brand and I'm going to sit out 6 months to a year. So I've got some investors and I'm going to start a competing brand. Is it that easy to do?
No, it's not going to be that easy. There's going to be two things. One is your non-compete is going to be probably longer. But let's suppose there was no non-compete. You have, as a result of using the operations manual, acquired confidential information. Okay? You're legally bound to keep that confidential. And you can't go out and simply use all of the things that you've learned. That's a very hard lesson to think about. You spend a lot of time, maybe 15, 20 years learning a trade, only to be told, well, at the end of this, all of these things or many of these things that you learned may be subject to confidential, the requirement to keep that confidential, and that is not use it for yourself.
Mm-hmm. And yet people attempt this quite a bit. And
people do a lot of strange things.
Yeah. Well, firstly, the non-compete in the United States, some states, the non-compete, you can't keep someone from earning a living.
No, there's definitely there. You've got that contractual non-compete, and then you've got a restraint of trade, an antitrust theme. Mm-hmm. And yes, you can't prevent people from earning a living. You see that very strong out in California, non-competes, at least at the employee level. And we see, the FTC taking a position about non-competes at the employee level. But still, let's suppose there was no contractual non-compete. from a practical point of view, you've given up your location. So you've given up, all of the goodwill attracted to that location. You've given up your customer list. You may even have given up the right to contact your customers.
Mm-hmm.
So there are lots of burdens on you or obstacles to you competing in the very same business. Now, having said this, what you do see now, and you did not see 10 or 15 years ago, is a lot more multi-unit, multi-brand, very large franchisees. People who are acquiring 2 or 3 different brands that compete against each other. So, I know there's some, at that large franchise, I'm talking about 80 units plus, you do see a different type of dynamic.
Mm-hmm.
But those are corporations too.
So another point here is that you're really not happy when you exit the system for whatever reason. Maybe you've made money, but they hassled you too much or whatever. You just got a vendetta. And on your way out, you happen to say to somebody who writes for the local paper or reports on television some disparaging remarks about the franchisor. Is that okay?
Even if true, not advised.
Yeah.
No, it's, you're going to, for various reasons, you've signed a contract which will likely include that you don't disparage the franchisor, and you can see the reasons for that from the franchisor's point of view, especially these days with the sort of social media being able to amplify any negative criticisms. The slightest negative criticism could, affect the entire system.
Mm-hmm.
And, why does your beef have to translate into something that economically harms the other operators? But yeah, it's again, one more thing, you wouldn't be, the last thing that you would sign in a divorce is something like, I can't disparage my ex. Yes, I can. I tell the world about that horrible person.
Well, when some experts will make a point of, in due diligence, get to the item 20 and look at previous or former franchisees, call them and see what they have to say. Well, usually those people are not to be found. First of all, the phone number won't even be accurate in that document. And even if you got them on the phone, if someone is unsettled about the franchisor and they know that if they make disparaging remarks, they can be sued, they're not going to tell you, true or not, they're not going to tell you this kind of information. So it's difficult to get that from a former franchisee, to spill the beans on whatever it might have been that they didn't like.
That advice to talk to all former franchisees is just, it is, I don't ever advise it because of there's the reason that you suggested you couldn't contact them. They're unwilling to talk to you anyway.
Yeah.
Might be under a confidentiality agreement that they signed as a result of litigation. And what are they going to tell you anyways?
Yeah.
Right? They may have had a horrible experience, and the people that they had the horrible experience with aren't even there anymore.
Yeah.
So
aside from a franchise system being great to horrible, those are that's a situation you've got to deal with up front before you make the investment. But when you make the investment, you need to know not everything is wonderful. Not everything is perfect about franchising. There are some disadvantages. But in business, aren't there always disadvantages involved in any deal? There's the pros and there are the cons. And you've got to be capable of handling the cons. What helps here, when in our discussion that you and I have just had, is that we're telling you what those negatives are up front.
Yeah, you can start to anticipate that. If you understand the system as being what's called, has been called, a system of co-opetition, where there's both cooperation and competition,
Yeah.
right? You've got competition among your other operators.
Yeah.
So, they're just not your friends either. You're in business against them some of the time too.
Yeah.
So all of this is going to cause a friction, and you have to be aware of the fact that, when things go difficult, when there are going to be these business difficulties, you just cannot walk away from the system. It's constructed to make, the clauses are constructed to make sure that most people see it through the term. And this can be very valuable. I mean, you could get through the term and say, that really was the best decision business-wise. But at the time,
No.
you might think otherwise.
All right. So in wrapping up, Michael, the bottom line here, yes, there are negatives. No, it's not a perfect world in franchising. But given everything we've just discussed, and assuming that you have some success in negotiating with the franchisor so that you've lightened the load here a little bit about these items, 10 items that we have talked about that are negatives, do you still buy a franchise? Are you still a proponent of?
Yeah, no, I'm a big proponent of franchising for people, the right system, for the right person. It's just a better team playing situation than if you're an employee, for the most part.
Well, on behalf of the Titus Center for Franchising and Palm Beach Atlantic University, Michael, thank you for joining me today.
Thanks, John. Really appreciate it. Talk to you soon.
All right.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thanks for tuning in to the Franchise Hot Seat Podcast with Dr. John P. Hayes. Tune in next time for more conversation around all things franchising.